The space station Harmony Point floated in the void between star systems like a silver flower made of metal and glass. Inside its main conference hall, Ambassador Helen Crawford checked her notes one last time before the meeting that could change everything. She had spent 3 years building trust with alien races, and now that work faced its biggest test. Her team sat quietly around the curved table that could seat delegates from 20 different worlds. Dr. Kevin Morris adjusted his translation device and glanced at the cultural briefing on his tablet. The Zephyrians were coming, and everyone knew. They did not like to talk their way out of problems. They preferred to fight first and ask questions later. Kevin had learned their language from old war recordings when the crystal beings had attacked mining colonies in the Outer Rim. Those conflicts ended badly for everyone involved. Captain Lisa Zhang stood near the main entrance doors checking security feeds on her wrist display. Her job was to keep diplomats safe, but she knew her small team of peacekeepers would be useless if the Zephyrians decided to start trouble. The alien stood 7 feet tall with crystal skin that could stop most weapons and claws that could cut through steel doors. Lisa had seen footage of what they did to enemy soldiers, and the images still gave her nightmares. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and the Zephyrian delegation entered the hall. Their leader, War Prime Krell-Thak, walked in front of 6 other warriors whose crystal armor caught the overhead lights and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. Each step they took sounded like breaking glass on the metal floor. Other alien diplomats in the hall shifted nervously in their seats as the Zephyrians took their places at the negotiation table. Ambassador Crawford stood and offered the traditional greeting in the Zephyrian language. Her pronunciation was perfect thanks to months of practice, but Krell-Thak did not seem impressed. The War Prime looked at her with eyes like burning coals set in a face made of living diamond. When he spoke, his voice sounded like rocks grinding together in an earthquake. Human ambassador, we have not come here to exchange pleasant words about weather and trade agreements. Your species has violated sacred territory that belongs to the Zephyrian Empire. 12 star systems that our ancestors claimed when your kind still lived in caves and threw rocks at predators. You will withdraw all human settlements immediately or face the consequences of your foolish expansion. Helen kept her voice calm and diplomatic, even though she could feel tension building in the room like electricity before a storm. She had dealt with territorial disputes before and knew that patient negotiation usually found solutions that satisfied everyone involved. War Prime Krell-Thak, we understand the historical significance of those systems to your people. Perhaps we can discuss territorial exchanges or resource sharing agreements that would benefit both our civilizations. Earth has mineral-rich worlds in other sectors that might interest the Zephyrian Empire. Krell-Thak slammed one crystal fist on the table with enough force to crack the thick surface. Several smaller alien delegates jumped at the sound and moved their chairs away from the Zephyrian section. You offer us trinkets and scraps like we are beggars asking for charity. The Zephyrian Empire does not make deals with species too weak to defend what they claim. Your diplomatic words are the babbling of cowards who have never faced real combat. Dr. Morris tried to help by explaining human cultural values and the benefits of peaceful cooperation, but the War Prime cut him off with a gesture that needed no translation. The other Zephyrian warriors began making sounds that their species used instead of laughter. It was not a pleasant sound to hear in a room meant for civilized discussion. Your scientists and peacekeepers prove what we already suspected about humanity. You are a soft species that hides behind treaties and negotiations because you lack the strength to take what you want by force. The galaxy would be better served if stronger races like ours guided the expansion of weaker civilizations. Like yours. Captain Zhang felt her hand move toward the weapon on her belt, but stopped herself before making things worse. She had read reports about human military capabilities and knew that peaceful diplomacy was a choice rather than a necessity. But the Zephyrians seemed to think that choosing peace meant being unable to fight. Ambassador Crawford made one final attempt to find a diplomatic solution. War Prime, surely we can find common ground without resorting to violence. Both our species have much to gain from cooperation and trade. The Galactic Council exists to prevent the kind of conflicts that devastated entire worlds in the past. Krelthok stood up to his full imposing height, and his crystal armor began to glow with inner light that meant he was becoming angry or excited about something. The Galactic Council recognizes the ancient laws of challenge combat between species. Since your kind claims to be civilized warriors, we invoke the right of trial by combat. Send your greatest fighters to face ours in honorable battle. When your champions fall bleeding on the arena floor, your species will accept its proper place as servants to the Zephyrian Empire. The hall fell silent except for the soft humming of air recycling systems. Ambassador Crawford felt her heart sink as she realized that 3 years of careful diplomatic work had just collapsed in the space of a few minutes. Ancient laws meant the Galactic Council could not interfere once a formal challenge was issued between member species. War Prime. Krelthak smiled with crystal teeth that reflected the overhead lights like tiny mirrors. You have one standard: week to prepare your champions human. Choose carefully because their failure will determine the fate of your entire civilization. The emergency meeting room in the Global Defense Council building buzzed with nervous energy as military leaders and government officials filed through security checkpoints. President Maria Santos arrived exactly on time and took her seat at the head of the long conference table. The weight of an entire species rested on the decisions they would make in the next few hours. General Patrick Kelly spread tactical reports across the polished surface and activated the wall display showing star charts of the disputed territories. His weathered face showed the strain of commanding Earth's military forces during a time when humanity preferred diplomatic solutions to armed conflicts. The Zephyrians have given us 1 week to select champions for trial by combat. Intelligence suggests they expect us to send our Solar Guard units. Dr. Amanda Foster pulled up psychological profiles of the Solar Guard on her tablet device. These elite peacekeepers represented the best of human military training with emphasis on non-lethal conflict resolution and protection of civilian populations. They had successfully ended dozens of small wars without causing unnecessary casualties or property damage. The Solar Guard would be the logical choice based on our recent military engagements. They have excellent combat records and represent our values as a civilization. Admiral Jake Newman leaned back in his chair and studied the faces around the table. He had spent 30 years in military service and knew the difference between peace through strength and peace through weakness. The problem is that Zephyrian intelligence has been monitoring our peacekeeping operations for months. They think they understand human combat capabilities based on missions where our forces used minimum necessary force. President Santos activated her security clearance and brought up classified files that made several committee members shift uncomfortably in their seats. According to these reports, the Zephyrians have specifically studied our humanitarian missions and peacekeeping deployments. They believe our restrained approach represents the upper limit of human military effectiveness. Colonel Ryan Davis had been sitting quietly in the corner, but now he spoke up with a voice that carried undertones of experiences most people preferred not to think about. Madam President, the Zephyrians are challenging our best because they think our best represents our maximum capability. They have never seen what happens when humanity decides that restraint is no longer an option. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. Everyone present knew that human history contained chapters that official records kept carefully classified. Before the era of diplomatic first contact, There had been other encounters with alien species that tested human resolve in ways that led to outcomes the current government preferred not to discuss publicly. General Kelly brought up older military files that required special authorization to access. The early contact wars were fought using methods that would horrify our current diplomatic corps. We won those conflicts, but the cost in terms of galactic reputation led to our current emphasis on peaceful negotiation and humanitarian intervention. Dr. Foster reviewed psychological reports from veterans of those forgotten campaigns and found patterns that disturbed her scientific objectivity. The soldiers who fought in the first contact wars show signs of trauma that our standard therapy, programs, cannot adequately address. They were trained to fight without the moral constraints that define our current military doctrine. Admiral Newman stood up and walked to the star chart, showing current human territory. The Zephyrians assume that because we choose to fight with rules of engagement and concern for collateral damage, we are incapable of fighting any other way. They mistake our mercy for weakness and our restraint for inability. President Santos had to make a decision that would echo through history regardless of the outcome. If we send the Solar Guard, they will fight honorably and probably lose against opponents who have no concept of proportional response. If we send conventional military units, the result will likely be the same. Colonel Davis accessed files that technically did not exist in any official database. There is a third option, Madam President. We have veterans from the early wars who understand what total conflict means. They carry psychological scars from learning how to fight without moral limitations, but they also carry the skills that won impossible battles. The committee spent hours debating the ethical implications of unleashing soldiers who had been taught to fight, like humanity did before it learned to value alien life. These were men and women who understood that sometimes the only way to preserve civilization was to temporarily abandon it on the battlefield. Dr. Foster raised concerns about asking traumatized veterans to return to combat situations that had damaged their mental health in the first place. These people have spent years learning to be human again after experiencing the psychological cost of unlimited warfare. Asking them to fight could undo decades of therapeutic progress. General Kelly pointed out the harsh reality of their situation. If humanity loses this challenge, we become servants to the Zephyrian Empire. Every human colony, every space station, and every civilian transport becomes subject to alien authority. The cost of losing is higher than the cost of winning. Admiral Newman brought up intelligence reports showing how other species viewed the upcoming combat trial. The entire galactic community is watching this confrontation. If we lose, our reputation for peaceful strength becomes a reputation for exploitable weakness. Other aggressive species will see us as easy targets. Colonel Davis made the argument that changed everything. The veterans from the early wars carry the burden of our violent capability so that everyone else can sleep peacefully at night. They became monsters so that humanity could remain civilized. If someone threatens our people, that is exactly the burden they were trained to carry. President Santos looked around the table at advisors who understood that leadership sometimes meant making choices that would haunt them forever. If we ask these veterans to fight, we are essentially admitting that our peaceful reputation was always an illusion maintained by keeping our capacity for violence carefully hidden. The final vote was unanimous, but not enthusiastic. They would contact the veterans of the early contact wars and ask them to represent humanity in trial by combat. The decision came with the understanding that regardless of the outcome, a galaxy would never look at humans the same way again, not because the meeting ended. Colonel Davis prepared to visit a facility that officially did not exist to speak with soldiers, who officially had never served in conflicts that officially never happened. The Zephyrians wanted to face humanity's greatest warriors, but they were about to discover the difference between humanity's best and humanity's most necessary. The mountain facility sat hidden among thick forests, where satellite surveillance could not penetrate, and curious civilians never wandered by accident. Dr. Rachel Stone walked through corridors that looked like a pleasant medical center, but contained security measures that would stop a military assault. Her patients needed protection from the outside world, as much as the outside world needed protection from what her patients had become during forgotten wars. Sergeant Bobby Harper sat in the common room, working on a wooden sculpture with hands that remained steady despite everything they had done years ago. The carving looked like a bird in flight, but his fellow residents knew it represented something else entirely. Bobby had earned his rank during the Void conflicts, where enemy forces learned that attacking human colonies meant facing retaliation without mercy or restraint. Commander Troy Jenkins read old books in the library corner where afternoon sunlight came through bulletproof windows. He preferred stories about ordinary people living ordinary lives because they reminded him of the civilization he had fought to protect. His unit had held defensive positions during the Titan massacres, using tactics that military academies no longer taught, because they crossed lines that civilized warfare was supposed to respect. Corporal Diana Bell tended a small garden outside the medical wing, where she grew vegetables that reminded her of Earth farms before she learned to kill efficiently in low-gravity environments. The Ice Moon campaigns had lasted 2 years and left her with skills that made peaceful civilian life almost impossible. She understood how to survive in situations where showing mercy meant dying along with everyone you were trying to protect. The facility housed 37 veterans from conflicts that official history books mentioned only as footnotes about early exploration hazards. These were the soldiers who had fought when first contact went catastrophically wrong and alien species tested human resolve with unprovoked attacks on defenseless settlements. They had responded with methods that made the galactic community recoil in horror and demand immediate peace negotiations. Stone understood that her patients carried psychological burdens that normal therapy could not address. They had been trained to fight without the moral constraints that defined civilized warfare, and the experience had changed them in ways that could never be completely reversed. Her job was helping them learn to be human again, after discovering what humans could become when civilization temporarily stopped applying. The morning routine included group sessions, where veterans talked about adjusting to life without constant threat assessment and violence preparation. Most had learned to control the reflexes that made them dangerous in civilian situations, but they could never completely forget the skills that had won impossible battles against overwhelming odds. Admiral Newman arrived at the facility accompanied by Colonel Davis and a security escort that understood the sensitivity of their mission. Dr. Stone met them at the main entrance and immediately objected to their presence. These people have spent years recovering from combat trauma that your government prefers to pretend never happened. Whatever you want, the answer is no. Colonel Davis explained the situation with the Zephyrian challenge and the threat to human civilization if Earth's champions lost the trial by combat. The aliens think they understand our military capabilities based on peacekeeping missions, where our forces used minimum necessary force. They have never seen what happens when we take the moral restraints away. Dr. Stone led them through the facility, pointing out patients who were finally learning to sleep without nightmares and eat meals without scanning for escape routes. You want me to ask people who barely survived becoming weapons to voluntarily return to that psychological state. The ethical implications alone should make this conversation impossible. Admiral Newman reviewed classified files showing how other aggressive alien species were watching the upcoming combat trial. If humanity loses this challenge, we become subjects of the Zephyrian Empire. Every human settlement becomes vulnerable to species that view our peaceful reputation as evidence of exploitable weakness. The 3 visitors found themselves in the common room where veterans continued their daily activities, but everyone could sense the tension that accompanied official military presence. These were people who had learned to read situations for threats and opportunities, even when they were trying to live peaceful civilian lives. Sergeant Harper looked up from his wood carving and studied the uniforms and security badges that identified their visitors as current military personnel. "Admiral, we know who you are, and we can guess why you came here. The question is whether you understand what you are actually asking us to do." Commander Jenkins closed his book and walked over to join the conversation that was becoming inevitable. "The techniques we learned during the early wars worked because they abandoned the moral framework that makes people human. You cannot simply turn that capability on and off like a weapon system." Corporal Bell came in from the garden with dirt still on her hands, and the 1,000-yard stare that never completely disappeared from veterans of total warfare. "We became what we became so that humanity could remain civilized. If someone is threatening our people, then carrying that burden is exactly what we volunteered for." Dr. Stone tried to protect her patients from a request that could undo years of therapeutic progress. These veterans have been learning to live with the psychological cost of unlimited violence. Asking them to fight again could destroy everything we have accomplished in their recovery process. Admiral Newman understood the moral complexity of their situation, but also understood the consequences of losing the challenge combat. "The Zephyrians expect to face our best soldiers using standard military doctrine. They have no concept of what human warfare looks like when we stop following rules designed to minimize casualties and collateral damage." Colonel Davis had fought alongside some of these veterans during campaigns that remained classified decades after the shooting stopped. The early contact wars ended with peace treaties because alien species realized that continuing the conflict would result in their complete extinction. We won those wars by becoming something that terrified our enemies into submission. The veterans spent hours discussing the request among themselves while their visitors waited in another room. Everyone understood that agreeing to fight meant returning to psychological states that had taken years to overcome through therapy and medication. But they also understood that refusing to fight might mean watching civilization collapse under alien occupation. Sergeant Harper spoke for the group when they finally reached consensus. "Admiral, we have been carrying the burden of human violence capability so that everyone else could sleep peacefully at night. If the Zephyrians want to discover what humanity looks like when we stop being civilized, then that is exactly the burden we were trained to carry." The facility began preparations for a mission that officially would never happen involving veterans who officially did not exist. D.R. Stone prepared medical files and psychological profiles while privately hoping that her patients would survive. Not only the physical combat, but also the psychological cost of becoming weapons again after learning to be human. The Zephyrian arena ship hung in space like a predator made of metal and crystal, waiting for prey to arrive. War Prime Krelthik stood on the observation deck, watching smaller vessels position themselves around the combat arena, while representatives from dozens of alien species prepared to witness what he expected would be a demonstration of Zephyrian superiority over the soft humans. The arena floor stretched below them like a metallic canyon, with walls designed to contain even the most violent combat between different species. Dark stains marked places where previous challengers had fallen, and Krelthok could already imagine how human blood would look against the polished surface. His warriors had spent days preparing for opponents they expected would fight with restraint and mercy. Ambassador Crawford made one final attempt at diplomatic resolution through the HIASA communication system, but her words sounded hollow in the face of ancient laws that demanded satisfaction through combat. War Prime, surely reasonable beings can find alternatives to violence that benefit both our civilizations. The galactic community has moved beyond settling disputes through bloodshed. Krelthok dismissed her plea with contempt that radiated through his crystalline structure. Your diplomatic weakness proves what our intelligence reports have told. Use about human nature. You fight with rules of engagement and concern for casualties because you lack the strength to embrace total victory. Such limitations make defeat inevitable. The alien observers took their positions in protected, viewing areas while recording equipment prepared to document. What most expected would become a cautionary tale about challenging superior species. Representatives from aggressive civilizations watched with particular interest because they viewed the outcome as a test of whether humanity deserved respect or conquest. Transmission arrived from the approaching human vessel, but the ship identification codes were unlike anything in Zephyrian. Intelligence files. Instead of the bright diplomatic transports or clearly marked military vessels associated with Earth's public forces, this craft appeared as a dark shape against the stars with no visible identification markings or ceremonial decorations. The human transport emerged from hyperspace with an arrival signature that suggested capabilities beyond standard civilian or military specifications. Krelthak studied the vessel through enhanced visual sensors and noticed details that made his crystalline spine tingle with unexpected unease. The ship looked functional rather than impressive and bore signs of modification for purposes that were not immediately obvious. Admiral Newman's voice came through communication channels with a tone that sounded different from previous diplomatic exchanges. War Prime Krelthak, we have brought champions as demanded by your challenge. These representatives will demonstrate human capabilities under combat conditions that your species has requested. The airlock opened with mechanical precision, and the first figure to emerge was Colonel Davis, but something fundamental had changed about his bearing and presence. Gone was the diplomatic restraint that characterized human military officials in public appearances. He moved with predatory awareness that suggested familiarity with violence as a professional tool rather than unfortunate necessity. Behind him came 12 humans in armor that bore no unit insignia or decorative elements. Their equipment looked functional rather than ceremonial, with modifications that spoke to experience in situations where survival mattered more than appearance. Each warrior carried weapons that seemed designed for efficiency rather than compliance with standard military regulations. Krelthek studied the human fighters through sensors that analyzed their physical capabilities and equipment specifications. The data confused him because these opponents seemed smaller and less impressive than the peacekeepers in intelligence reports. Their armor showed signs of field modification, and their weapons appeared to be personal rather than standard issue. The humans moved across the arena floor with coordination that suggested shared experience in situations where individual survival depended on group efficiency. They spread out in formation patterns that Krelthak did not recognize from standard military doctrine. Each fighter seemed to understand the other's capabilities without verbal communication or obvious signals. One of the humans removed his helmet, revealing a scarred face with eyes that held depths of experience that made Krelthak's crystal structure shiver involuntarily. This was Sergeant Harper, but the man who stood in the arena bore little resemblance to the diplomatic peacekeepers that Zephyrian intelligence had studied for months. The other human fighters began equipment checks with methodical precision that spoke to familiarity with combat situations where equipment failure meant death rather than mission compromise. Their weapons showed signs of use and modification that suggested owners who understood the tools of violence as professional necessities rather than ceremonial accessories. Krelthak's warriors prepared for combat according to traditional Zephyrian methods that had won countless arena victories against other species. They expected opponents who would fight with honor and restraint like the human peacekeepers in intelligence files. The crystal beings had no concept of what happened when humans abandoned moral constraints that normally guided their military operations. Commander Jenkins stood in the arena center and spoke directly to Krelthak through communication systems. War Prime, your intelligence reports studied our peacekeeping forces and humanitarian missions. Those operations represent how we choose to fight when we wish to minimize casualties and preserve civilian populations. You challenged our best, but what you will face today represents something else entirely. The Zephyrian warriors began ritual preparations that involved increasing their crystal armor, luminosity, and extending natural claws designed to rend flesh and bone. They had studied human anatomy and knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage against opponents who would fight according to civilized rules of engagement. Corporal Bell checked her equipment one final time and looked up at the observation deck where alien diplomats prepared to witness what they expected would be a demonstration of human weakness. Her expression showed professional detachment that came from understanding violence as a tool rather than an unfortunate necessity. The arena combat protocols activated, and energy barriers sealed the fighting space while sensors prepared to record every detail of the encounter for galactic archives. War Prime Krulfek felt confidence flowing through his crystalline structure as he anticipated victory that would establish Zephyrian dominance over human space. Colonel Davis gave a hand, signal that meant nothing to Zephyrian intelligence, but caused immediate changes in human formation and equipment status. The 12 veterans spread out across the arena floor with movements that suggested familiarity with combat in environments where showing mercy meant dying along with everyone you were trying to protect. The combat trial was about to begin, but neither side understood what the other truly represented. The Zephyrians expected to face restrained peacekeepers, while the humans prepared to demonstrate why their species chose diplomatic solutions whenever possible, rather than unleashing capabilities that had terrified entire alien civilizations into immediate surrender. The arena combat began according to ancient Zephyrian traditions that demanded victory through death or complete submission of the opposing force. Energy barriers activated around the fighting space, while recording systems prepared to document what War Prime Krulfek expected would become a demonstration of crystal warrior superiority over soft human opponents who fought with restraint and mercy. The Zephyrian champions charged across the arena floor with roars that echoed off the metal walls like breaking thunder. Their crystal armor caught the overhead lighting and threw rainbow patterns across the combat space, while natural claws extended to full length for maximum damage against human flesh. Each warrior stood 7 feet tall with muscle and bone that could crush normal opponents through sheer physical force. Sergeant Harper moved first among the human fighters with speed that surprised the approaching Zephyrians, who had expected slower opponents based on intelligence reports about peacekeeping operations. His combat knife appeared in his hand like magic, and the blade seemed to be made from materials that did not match standard military equipment specifications. The first crystal warrior reached Harper with claws extended for a killing strike, but found empty air where his target had been standing a moment before. The human had moved with economical precision that wasted no motion while placing him in position to strike at joints between crystal armor plates that should have been impossible to target during active combat. Harper's knife slid between crystal segments with surgical accuracy that spoke to understanding of Zephyrian anatomy that went far beyond what diplomatic peacekeepers should possess. The blade penetrated vital areas with efficiency that suggested training in techniques that civilized military doctrine did not normally include in standard curricula. Commander Jenkins engaged 2 Zephyrian warriors simultaneously using methods that made the watching alien diplomats shift uncomfortably in their observation seats. Instead of meeting brute force with brute force, he used their own momentum and aggression against them while targeting psychological pressure points that turned their honor-based combat doctrine into a liability. The human veterans fought with coordination that came from shared experience in situations where individual survival depended on group efficiency and ruthless elimination of threats. They covered each other's movements while exploiting weaknesses in Zephyrian tactics that became obvious once you stopped worrying about fighting honorably. Corporal Bell demonstrated why the Ice Moon campaigns had ended with alien surrender rather than negotiated peace treaties. Her weapons seemed designed for maximum efficiency rather than compliance with standard rules of engagement, and she used them with professional detachment that came from understanding violence as a necessary tool rather than unfortunate accident. Arena environment itself became a weapon in human hands as veterans used decorative elements and architectural features in ways that Zephyrian combat doctrine had never considered possible. What looked like ceremonial fixtures became improvised tools for increasing damage and eliminating opponents with methods that violated every civilized norm of trial by combat. War Prime Krelthak, watched from the observation deck as his warriors began falling to opponents who fought without the moral constraints that intelligence reports had suggested defined human military capabilities. These were not the restrained peacekeepers who used minimum necessary force to protect civilian populations. During humanitarian missions, the humans fought in complete silence that was more disturbing than battle cries or expressions of anger. Their faces showed professional concentration rather than emotional engagement as they systematically dismantled opponents twice, their size using techniques that seemed designed to maximize psychological impact on anyone watching the encounter. Zephyrian crystal armor that could deflect energy weapons proved inadequate against human weapons and tactics that had been developed during conflicts where conventional military doctrine failed to achieve necessary objectives. The veterans understood how to bypass protection systems while targeting vulnerabilities that most civilized species preferred not to exploit. The combat became increasingly one-sided as Zephyrian warriors discovered that their traditional advantages meant nothing against opponents who had abandoned the moral framework that normally constrained human military operations. Size and strength became liabilities when facing adversaries who understood how to use superior physical capabilities against their possessors. Colonel Davis coordinated the human assault with hand signals that conveyed tactical information without revealing capabilities or intentions to enemies who might survive the encounter. The veterans moved through the arena like shadows that struck without warning and disappeared before retaliation could reach them. The watching alien diplomats began to understand that they had been witnessing carefully restrained human military capabilities during previous conflicts. What they saw in the arena represented something fundamentally different from the peacekeeping forces that had built humanity's reputation for reasonable diplomatic solutions to territorial disputes. Krelthak's crystal structure began showing stress fractures as he realized that Zephyrian intelligence had completely misunderstood what human military forces looked like when they stopped following rules designed to minimize casualties and collateral damage. These warriors fought like they had been trained to achieve victory regardless of cost or consequence. The arena floor became a demonstration of why alien civilizations had demanded immediate peace negotiations after the early contact wars. Human veterans who had learned to fight without moral constraints could achieve battlefield results that terrified species with superior technology and physical capabilities. Harper finished the last Zephyrian warrior with efficiency that spoke to understanding. Violence as a professional skill rather than emotional release. The combat had lasted less than 20 minutes, but the results would change how the galactic community understood human nature and military potential. The energy barriers deactivated, and the arena fell silent, except for the soft humming of life. Support systems. 12 human veterans stood among the remains of Zephyrian champions, while alien observers tried to process what they had witnessed. The trial by combat was over, but the real consequences were just beginning. War Prime. Krelthak stared at the arena floor where his greatest warriors lay defeated by opponents who represented capabilities the human diplomatic corps had kept carefully hidden from galactic view. He finally understood that humanity's peaceful reputation was maintained by choosing restraint rather than inability to embrace total warfare. The veterans began collecting their equipment with the same professional detachment they had shown during combat. They moved like people who had performed necessary but unpleasant work and were ready to return to whatever came next without celebrating victory or mourning the necessity of violence. The aftermath of the arena combat rippled through the galactic community like shock waves from an exploding star. Ambassador Crawford found herself addressing the Galactic Council while alien representatives struggled to understand how their fundamental assumptions about human nature had been so completely wrong. The peaceful species they thought they knew had revealed depths that changed everything about interspecies relations. War Prime. Krelthok formally withdrew all Zephyrian territorial claims in a ceremony that violated every tradition of his warrior culture. His crystal structure showed permanent stress fractures from the psychological trauma of watching his greatest champions destroyed by opponents he had dismissed as weak and soft. The proud warrior who had demanded trial by combat now spoke in whispers about human capabilities that defied comprehension. President Santos convened an emergency session of the Global Defense Council to address the consequences of revealing military capabilities that Earth had kept hidden for decades. The victory in arena combat had achieved its immediate objective, but created new challenges that would affect human civilization for generations to come. Colonel Davis delivered classified briefings to intelligence services throughout known space, without revealing specific details about training methods or equipment specifications. His message was simple, but terrifying for species that had viewed humanity as a peaceful civilization suitable for exploitation or conquest. The warriors you observed represent damaged veterans, fighting with obsolete equipment, while handicapped by moral constraints they imposed on themselves through force of habit. The implications spread through alien military establishments like wildfire as generals and war planners realized that human peacekeeping forces represented carefully restrained capabilities rather than maximum effort. Species that had been planning aggressive expansion into human territory began reconsidering their strategic objectives when they understood what total human warfare actually looked like. Trade negotiations suddenly became more favorable to Earth, as alien civilizations competed to establish positive relationships with the species they now understood could destroy them completely if diplomatic solutions failed. Border disputes that had simmered for years were resolved through immediate negotiation when aggressive neighbors realized that continued conflict might provoke responses they were not prepared to face. The 12 veterans who fought in the arena returned to Dr. Stone's facility, but could not simply resume their previous lives after demonstrating capabilities that had reopened psychological wounds requiring years to heal. Their victory had saved human civilization, but cost them whatever peace they had managed to achieve through therapy and medication. Admiral Newman visited the mountain facility to check on soldiers who had sacrificed their mental health to preserve galactic peace. The entire human species owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Your actions in the arena prevented a war that would have devastated countless worlds and killed billions of innocent people. Sergeant Harper spoke for the group, with words that carried the weight of experiences most people could never understand. Admiral, we did what was necessary so that others would not have to make the same sacrifices. Knowing that our actions preserved civilization is sufficient reward for whatever personal cost we might pay. Dr. Stone prepared new treatment protocols for veterans who had voluntarily returned to psychological states that normal therapy programs could not adequately address. The heroes who saved humanity would require specialized care for trauma that came from temporarily abandoning moral constraints that defined civilized behavior. the Galactic Council established new diplomatic protocols based on understanding that human restraint was a choice rather than a limitation. Species that had viewed Earth's peaceful reputation as evidence of weakness now competed to avoid any actions that might provoke humans to abandon their self-imposed moral constraints. Ambassador Crawford returned to Harmony Point, where alien diplomats treated human proposals with respect that bordered on fear. Trade agreements and territorial disputes were resolved with unprecedented speed as other species discovered that cooperation was vastly preferable to discovering. What happened when humanity stopped being reasonable? Intelligence agencies throughout known space began reassessing their understanding of human military capabilities, based on the realization that public military operations represented minimum necessary force rather than maximum available force. The arena combat had revealed that Earth possessed veterans with skills that could achieve battlefield objectives, regardless of technological or numerical disadvantages. President Santos addressed the nation about the challenge combat without, revealing classified details about the veterans who had fought in the arena. Our victory was achieved by brave volunteers who demonstrated that humanity's greatest strength is not our capacity for violence, but our choice to use restraint even when facing existential threats. The galaxy slowly adjusted to a new understanding of human nature that recognized peaceful diplomacy as evidence of strength rather than weakness. Species that had been planning aggressive actions against human colonies quietly abandoned those plans when they realized that continuing such behavior might provoke responses that would end their civilizations. Colonel Davis prepared reports for future military leaders about the strategic value of maintaining a reputation for restraint while possessing capabilities that could achieve total victory when diplomatic solutions failed. The arena combat taught the galactic community that humanity chooses peace not from inability to wage war, but from understanding of what total war actually costs. The veterans at the mountain facility continued their recovery process with the knowledge that their sacrifice had preserved both human civilization and galactic peace. They had become weapons so that others could remain human, and their actions in the arena had demonstrated why choosing restraint was always humanity's preferred option. The story ended where it began with diplomatic negotiations on Harmony Point. But now alien representatives understood the human reasonableness was backed by capabilities that made cooperation the only sensible choice. The galaxy had learned that the most dangerous species were often those who understood exactly how much damage they could cause and chose not to inflict it unless absolutely necessary. Ambassador Crawford smiled as she reviewed trade proposals. That would have been unthinkable before the arena combat. Humanity had revealed its true nature to the galactic community and discovered that sometimes showing strength was the only way to preserve peace. The challenge had asked for humanity's best and received something far more valuable, a demonstration of why choosing civilization was always the better option.